In the sun-blistered village of Kijiji Chamwisho, where the dust never truly settled and the drums of war had barely stopped echoing, peace came wrapped in an unwanted wedding shawl. Afia, the youngest daughter of the blacksmith, was chosen, not asked, not consulted, just chosen, to marry Malik, a warrior from the rival clan of Mamba Nyusi. His body was broken from battle, his spirit hushed by a wound no one could name. He was a peace offering, wounded goods in exchange for a ceasefire. The elders called it wisdom. The women called it madness. The children whispered that it was a funeral with a bride. Afia stood in her wedding cloth, red not for love but for lineage. Her eyes held storms. She did not cry. Her tears had been traded the moment her father clasped hands with Malik's elder brother and agreed to bind her to a man who barely breathed. They said Malik was once mighty, his spear faster than the wind, his voice like rolling thunder. But now he lay in a shadowed hut at the edge of the village, wrapped in silence, staring at nothing. His skin was pale under the heavy dusk, and his mouth hadn't moved in days. The old one said he had been cursed. The young one said he was already halfway to the spirit world. Still, they forced her to sit beside him, hands folded like a statue carved from defiance. She was told to feed him, wash him, sleep beside him. She did so, not because she obeyed but because she refused to let her silence be mistaken for submission. When he wouldn't open his mouth for food, she whispered stories, tales of girls who walked with lions, of winds that could sing, of mountains that bled when insulted. At first she spoke out of obligation. But as the nights grew longer and her voice the only thing living in that hut, she began to speak from something else. Loneliness, maybe? Or hope. Sometimes she looked at him and thought, "You are not dying. You are hiding." She began to mark time with a sharpened stick. On the wooden floor beside his sleeping mat, she carved her name, He. Every stroke dug into the wood as if her identity needed anchoring. She carved other things too, spirals for days, triangles for rage, birds for the hour she wanted to fly away. Her fingers blistered, but the carvings gave her peace. They were the only proof she existed in a life that had been taken from her and planted in someone else's tragedy. The villagers muttered. She sings to a corpse. She's cursed now too. But they kept their distance. Kijiji Chamwisho was built on blood and secrets. No one wanted to get too close to either. Malik never moved. Not when she braided her hair beside him. Not when she sang lullabies her mother once sang. Not when she wept, quietly, on nights when the silence grew teeth and bit her soul. But Afia wasn't the kind to fade. She scrubbed his skin until it glowed faintly. She learned the patterns of his breathing like a sacred rhythm. She placed herbs under his pillow, left milk by the door for spirits, and whispered defiance into the rafters. She wasn't praying for his recovery. She wasn't hoping for love. She was carving a space in this silence that belonged to her. One night, when the moon was a slit in the sky, she heard something strange, something between a sigh and a cough. She turned. Malik's eyes were open, focused, not dull. He didn't speak. His lips didn't move. But he was there. Afia didn't smile. She didn't leap. She just sat and whispered another story, this one about a girl who married a ghost and taught it how to live again. The next morning, the carved wood around his bed was darker than before, as if it had drunk something from the night. The days passed. Afia continued her rituals. And Malik's eyes followed her more. Once she found his fingers twitching. Another time she swore she heard his throat attempt to swallow. But he never spoke. Not one word. And yet it was enough. One evening a storm rolled in. Not of rain but of dust and wind, shaking the thatched roofs like angry fists. Afia held the hut together with ropes and hope. Malik stared at the ceiling, unmoved. But when a large gust burst the door open, flinging sand into the room, Afia rushed to close it, and Malik's hand, slow but certain, reached for her arm. He didn't grip it. He only touched it like he was grounding himself in the present. She froze. He looked at her, truly looked at her. Then he let go. She didn't speak of it. She didn't tell the elders. She didn't tell the wind. But that night she carved his name next to hers on the floor. Malik. Not in hope. In warning. In promise. In presence. And still the villagers whispered. Why hasn't he died? Maybe she is a witch. Maybe he is. The whispers didn't touch her. She had her space, her floor, her name. She had her stories. And now she had a spark. One day, a group of village boys dared each other to peek into the hut and see the ghost husband. They returned pale and silent, claiming the man's eyes had glowed like fire. One claimed he saw Malik blink once for every name they said aloud. The children stopped playing near the hut. The chickens refused to roost nearby. Even the dogs kept away. But inside the hut, something was growing. Afia began carving shapes in the wood that matched her dreams: wings, masks, flames. She told stories of people who rose from death, not as monsters but as messengers. Sometimes Malik blinked twice at the end of a tale. It became a ritual. She spoke, he blinked. She didn't ask what his silence meant. She didn't try to break it. She began to think his silence was not weakness but a decision. A shield. A strategy. And in that silence they built something no one else understood. A truce had brought them together. But it was not the truce that kept them in that hut, night after night. It was not duty anymore. It was something else. Afia still resented what had been taken from her. But now she had claimed something back. Not a man. Not love. But space. Identity. And on the night the village drums returned, calling people to a new feast of unity, Afia didn't attend. She sat beside Malik, her fingers carving a sun into the wood. And Malik, silent as ever, reached for the carving stick and, slowly, shakily, finished the last curve. In the stillness of the night, beneath a canopy of stars that shimmered like scattered embers, Afia's voice wove through the darkness. Her melodies, once met with silence, now stirred something within the confines of the hut. Malik's eyes, previously vacant, began to follow her movements, acknowledging her presence with a subtle nod or a gentle blink. Though his lips remained sealed, his gaze spoke volumes, conveying a silent gratitude and a burgeoning connection. As days turned into weeks, Malik's transformation became evident. His once pallid complexion gained a healthy hue, and the wounds that marred his body healed with an uncanny swiftness. He moved with a newfound strength, his steps deliberate and steady, yet he maintained his vow of silence. The villagers watched with a mix of awe and trepidation, their whispers growing louder with each passing day. "He walks among us yet speaks not a word," they murmured. "What secrets does he harbor in his silence?" Fear began to take root, and some questioned the wisdom of the union that had brought him into their midst. Medium. +6. Wikipedia. +6. Brahma Kumari's official. +6. Unperturbed by the growing unease, Afia continued her nightly rituals. She shared tales of distant lands and ancient legends, her voice a soothing balm in the quiet of the night. Malik listened intently, his responses limited to subtle gestures, a tilt of the head, a soft touch on her hand, a shared glance that spoke of understanding. Their bond deepened in the absence of words, a silent communion that transcended the need for speech. In Malik's silence, Afia found a companion who listened without judgment, who offered solace without platitudes. Together, they navigated the complexities of their unconventional relationship, finding strength in their shared resilience. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the village, Afia noticed Malik standing at the edge of the forest. He extended his hand towards her, inviting her to join him. Without hesitation, she took his hand, and together they ventured into the woods, the path ahead illuminated by the fading light. In the heart of the forest, they discovered a clearing where the air was thick with the scent of blooming flowers and the gentle hum of nature. Malik knelt beside a cluster of wildflowers, his fingers tracing patterns in the soil. Afia watched as he created intricate designs, symbols that seemed to tell a story known only to him. As the days passed, Malik's silent expressions became more elaborate. He communicated through drawings, gestures, and the occasional melody played on a handmade flute. Afia learned to interpret his unspoken language, their connection deepening with each shared moment. The villagers, witnessing Malik's transformation and the profound bond between him and Afia, began to reconsider their initial apprehensions. They saw a man who, though silent, contributed to the community with unwavering dedication and a gentle spirit. Their fear gave way to admiration, and Malik's silence was no longer seen as a threat but as a testament to his strength and resilience. In time, the story of Afia and Malik became a cherished tale within the village, a narrative of healing, understanding, and the power of connection beyond words. Their journey served as a reminder that sometimes, the most profound conversations are held in silence, and the deepest bonds are forged without uttering a single word. Malik had grown into a figure wrapped in mystery, moving through the dense forest like a shadow with purpose. Each day, he vanished into the thick trees just beyond the village, his footsteps light but deliberate. Afia, curious and concerned, began to follow him quietly, keeping her distance but never losing sight of him. She watched as he moved with a precision and strength that no living man should possess. He was sharper, faster, and more alert than ever before. There was a silent energy about him, a presence that commanded the woods to still themselves when he passed. One afternoon, deep in the heart of the forest, Afia saw Malik stop abruptly near a tall, ancient tree. Kneeling down, he began to carve something into the bark with a small, sharp stone he carried on a cord around his neck. The symbols he etched were unfamiliar to her at first, complex and flowing, resembling shapes of old animals and winding rivers. It was clear these carvings were not random. They held a purpose, a message, or a power from a time before her village was torn apart by hatred and war. These symbols looked like the language of the earth itself, ancient and alive. As she watched in silence, Malik finished his work and stood, eyes scanning the forest as if listening to whispers only he could hear. Suddenly, a sharp cry broke the quiet. A child no older than 7 had wandered too close to a hidden snake's nest. The venomous snake struck suddenly, its fangs poised to deliver a deadly bite. Malik was faster than any hunter, moving without hesitation and with a fluid motion. He shielded the child with his own body, catching the snake's strike on his forearm. There was no cry, no shout, only a silent gesture of protection. The snake hissed and retreated, and Malik gently lifted the trembling child from the ground, laying a steady hand on his back. Without a word, he vanished back into the shadows of the trees. Days passed with Malik absent from the village. Afia worried, but no one else seemed to notice or care. The elders, however, had begun to speak in hushed tones, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and reverence. One evening an old woman, the village's wisest elder, came to Afia's home. Her eyes were clouded with age, but her voice was sharp as she warned, "This silence, it is unnatural, child." Malik did not simply rise from the dead. He came back without his voice so the land could speak through him. Afia felt a chill as the elder's words settled in her mind. She wondered what force had taken Malik's voice. Was it a curse? A sacrifice? Or something far older than either of them could understand? Was the man she tended truly Malik, or had she awakened something buried beneath the stories and scars of their blood feud? That night, as the village slept, Afia slipped out to the forest where Malik's carvings still marked the trees like living runes. She traced her fingers over the symbols, feeling the rough bark and the coolness beneath. The forest seemed to breathe around her, pulsing with a quiet power. She whispered his name, and in response, a breeze stirred the leaves gently as if the earth itself was acknowledging her. The next morning Malik returned without explanation. He said nothing, his eyes carrying a depth of silence that spoke volumes. He trained harder now, moving through the forest with a grace and power that belonged to a spirit, not a man. Afia watched as he carved new symbols, each one more intricate than the last, weaving a tapestry of ancient language between the trees and the land itself. She began to understand that Malik's silence was not emptiness but a channel for something greater, a connection to the earth, to the ancestors, to the forgotten stories of their people. Yet there was also a lingering fear. If Malik had become the voice of the land, what had he lost of himself? And what price would the village pay for this strange and silent power? Each night, Afia sat by his side, speaking softly, telling stories and dreams, sharing fragments of a life she hoped to rebuild. Malik listened, responding only with small gestures. A nod, a touch, a look that held understanding deeper than words. Slowly, Afia realized that healing Malik was more than tending his body. It was about learning to hear the silence and trust what it carried. Her love for him grew, not despite his silence but because of the mysterious strength it revealed. In the forest, the carvings multiplied, and so did the whispers among the villagers. Some looked upon Malik with awe, others with dread. Afia stood by him, a quiet pillar between two worlds, the living and the forgotten, the sound and the silence. Together they navigated the fragile balance of power and peace, hope and fear, knowing that their fate was bound to the ancient language etched not just in wood, but in the very soul of the land itself. One morning, as the first light filtered through the dense canopy of the forest, Afia wandered farther than she ever had before. The air was thick with the scent of earth and moss, and the forest seemed quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. She noticed the trees Malik had carved, their ancient symbols now familiar to her eyes, but something about the ground nearby caught her attention. Disturbed soil, faint impressions beneath the leaves. Curious, she knelt down and began to brush away the fallen twigs and dirt. Her heart caught in her throat when she uncovered brittle fragments of bone, scattered yet unmistakably human. They were hidden beneath the roots of one of Malik's marked trees, nestled in a shallow grave that time had almost erased. Afia's hands trembled as she touched the remains, feeling the weight of history and sorrow buried beneath the soil. That evening she brought the discovery to Malik. Without a word, he rose and followed her silently into the forest. He moved with the calm certainty of one who knew every path and secret of the land. He stopped at each site where bones had been uncovered, and together, they worked to lay the remains to rest again, but this time with reverence and ceremony. Malik carefully arranged the bones, while Afia gathered herbs and flowers from the forest, weaving them into small wreaths. Their rituals were quiet yet profound. Chants whispered to the wind, ashes scattered to the earth, hands joined in silent prayer. It was as if the land itself was listening, and the restless spirits buried beneath responded with a peaceful stillness. Each burial was a healing for the village and a step toward ending the wounds left by the feud that had ravaged their people. As the days passed, Afia's nights grew heavy with dreams. They were vivid and haunting, visions of Malik in a time long gone, a young warrior cloaked in dust and blood. She saw the battles he had fought, the faces of fallen enemies and comrades alike, the rage and despair that carved silence into his soul. In her dreams, Malik was surrounded by war cries that never reached his lips, his voice stolen not by choice but by the weight of shame and loss. When she awoke, the images lingered like shadows and she felt compelled to capture them. With charcoal and pigments made from the forest, Afia began to paint her dreams on the walls of their humble home. The strokes were raw and honest, scenes of violence intertwined with moments of sorrow and silence. She painted Malik as she saw him in her visions, both fierce and broken, a man caught between worlds. Each morning, Malik would touch the paintings with reverence, his fingers tracing the lines and figures as if recognizing a forgotten truth. The house, once a simple shelter, began to change. It breathed with the weight of memory and spirit. It was no longer just a home or a grave, it became something sacred, a place where past and present converged. Villagers who passed by sensed the shift. Some hesitated, unsure whether to approach or stay away from the house that held so many stories written on its walls. Others came quietly, seeking solace or answers, drawn by the silent power that seemed to emanate from within. Afia and Malik welcomed them with open hearts, their presence a balm for wounds that ran deep. In the evenings, Afia and Malik would sit side by side, the walls around them alive with the painted echoes of history. Their silence was filled with understanding, a shared acknowledgement that healing required more than words. It demanded respect for the bones beneath their feet and the stories carved into their souls. Through their rituals and quiet communion, the village slowly began to change. The feud's bitterness softened, replaced by a fragile hope that grew like the plants around the ancient trees. The bones beneath Malik's carvings became a reminder that peace was possible, that even the darkest wounds could be tended with care and courage. Afia often thought about the weight Malik carried, the silence he bore not just as punishment but as protection. She understood now that his voice had been taken to shield the village from further bloodshed, to carry the pain so others would not have to. And in honoring the bones, she honored him, the man who rose from death and silence to become a guardian of their shared future. Their home stood as a testament, a sacred space woven from loss and love, memory and renewal. It was a place where the past was not forgotten but embraced, where silence held meaning, and where healing began beneath the bones that bore Malik's name. The night had come, heavy with expectation and silence, as the villagers of Kijiji Chamwisho gathered in the clearing at the heart of their home. This was the night when the fire was always lit, an ancient ritual passed down through generations to honor the ancestors whose spirits guarded the village. The crackling warmth of the flames had always been a promise of protection, of blessings, and of the steady continuity of life. But this year was different. The logs, carefully stacked and drenched with oils and herbs, refused to catch flame. No matter how many times the elders struck their flints, no matter how many prayers were whispered into the smoke, the fire lay cold and silent like a heavy stone in the night. Flickers of panic and confusion rippled through the crowd. Some began to mutter, casting nervous glances at one another. Afia stood nearby, feeling the weight of the villagers' unease pressing on her chest. She looked at Malik, whose presence beside her was quiet but steady, like a shadow cast by the fading moonlight. He was still mute, but there was something about him tonight that felt different, a stillness that held the promise of change. Without hesitation, Malik stepped forward and entered the circle of logs. The murmurs from the villagers hushed, replaced by a tense stillness. In his hand he carried something small and fragile, a single feather, pale as moonlight, delicate as a whisper. Afia followed him, feeling a ripple of anticipation that stilled the doubts swirling in her mind. Malik gently placed the feather upon the pile of wood, and before anyone could blink, a sudden flare erupted. The logs burst into flames, bright and fierce, burning with a warmth that seemed almost alive. The fire danced higher than it had in memory, crackling with a sound like the heartbeat of the earth itself. The villagers gasped, some falling to their knees, others reaching out as if to touch the miraculous blaze. Afia's voice rose, clear and unwavering in the hush of the crowd. The fire listens to what the tongue cannot say. Her words carried through the night like a spell, a truth that sank deep into the hearts of those who heard it. The fire was no longer just wood and flame, it was a language beyond speech, a voice for the silence Malik carried and for the unspoken pain and hope of the village. From that night onward, Afia became known as the wife of the wounded flame. It was a title spoken with reverence and awe, whispered among the elders and sung softly by the children who gathered near the hearths. They saw in her the courage to face the broken and the silent, to speak not with words but with actions that healed and united. Malik too became a figure of both reverence and quiet fear. The villagers saw in him a man who had transcended death and silence, a warrior whose very presence was a testament to sacrifice and strength. Yet his silence unnerved many. Some feared the unknown power that lay beneath his calm exterior, the unspoken stories etched into his stillness. Despite the fear, no one could deny the power Malik held. The fire that would not burn had become a symbol of transformation, a miracle born from the depths of pain and silence. The villagers began to gather not just to honor their ancestors but to witness the bond between the silent warrior and the woman who spoke for him. Afia stood beside Malik during every ceremony, her hands steady, her heart open. She understood that the fire was a bridge, between past and future, between silence and voice, between life and the memory of those who had come before. Together they carried the flame, a living testament to the resilience of their people and the power found in healing what was once broken. The night fires continued to burn bright, fueled not just by wood and feather but by the unyielding spirit of a village learning to listen to the unspoken and honor the wounds that shaped them all. Malik's body grew still as the sun set behind the hills, the familiar rhythms of the village fading into the quiet night. But this stillness was different, deeper, colder, as if the life within him was slowly slipping away. His breath became shallow, barely more than a whisper against the silent room. His skin turned pale and cold, like stone left out in the rain. The villagers who came to check on him stepped back in fear, whispering that the warrior who had once risen silent and strong was now slipping back into death's grasp. For 3 days and 3 nights, Malik lay in this trance-like sleep. Time seemed to stretch thin, each moment heavy with dread. Afia refused to leave his side, sitting beside him with trembling hands and a heart full of prayer. She wept quietly, her tears falling onto the rough wooden floor of their home. With a fragile hope, she began to chant his name, Malik, over and over, her voice weaving through the stillness like a thread of life. She gathered ash from their hearth, mixing it with water to form a paste, and with a careful finger she wrote his name on the walls, on the ground, and on her own skin. This ritual became her way of holding on to him, calling back the warrior from the edge of darkness. The village watched in anxious silence, some offering whispered prayers, others lighting candles and leaving small offerings at the doorstep. They knew Malik was not just a man. He was a symbol, a guardian whose silence had saved them in ways they still barely understood. Losing him now felt like losing the fragile peace that had finally settled after so many years of bloodshed. Then, just as the third dawn broke over the horizon, Malik's eyes slowly opened. The color was faint but real, a spark of life flickering within their depths. He sat up with a strength that startled Afia and the watchers, his movements deliberate and steady. Without a word, Malik stood and walked to the village gate, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains rising beyond the valley. Afia followed him, heart pounding with a mix of relief and worry. She watched as Malik raised a hand and pointed toward the jagged peaks where the sun met the sky. In that silent gesture, she understood something profound. Malik was preparing to leave. But this was no ordinary departure. There was a purpose behind it, a final reckoning that he could not avoid. Her mind raced through stories told by the elders, ancient tales of the feud that had scarred their land for generations. Among those stories was one dark thread, a forgotten enemy whose curse had marked Malik long ago, a curse meant to silence and break him, to end his life before it truly began. That enemy was not gone. The wounds in the past still bled beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to strike again. Afia knew she could not let Malik go alone. The bond they had forged through silence, pain, and healing was stronger than words. She vowed to follow him to the ends of the earth if needed, to stand beside him in whatever battle awaited. The village, sensing the weight of this moment, gathered behind them quietly, their faces etched with both fear and hope. As Malik took the first steps toward the mountains, The wind picked up, carrying with it whispers of old grudges and unfinished business. The warrior who had died again was walking toward a destiny that would decide not only his fate but the future of Kijiji Chamwisho. And Afia, silent and steadfast, would be there, the light beside his shadow, ready to face whatever darkness awaited. At the first light of dawn, the village of Kijiji Chamwisho stirred uneasily. The air was thick with tension as whispers of an approaching rival clan spread like wildfire. No one slept well that night, knowing the blood feud that had once ravaged the land might flare again. When the first shadows of the enemy appeared at the horizon, Malik stepped forward alone, his figure steady and silent against the rising sun. The rival warriors laughed when they saw him coming, just one man, silent and calm, without the usual war cries or drumbeats that heralded battle. To them Malik was already defeated. Their taunts cut through the cold morning air as they mocked the quiet man who dared to meet them without voice or challenge. But Malik did not flinch. His silence was not weakness, it was a calm before a storm none could foresee. Without warning Malik moved. His body flowed with a grace and precision that spoke of years of training and an unyielding spirit. Every strike, every dodge was flawless, executed without haste but with deadly intent. The enemy, caught off guard by his quiet ferocity, found themselves falling one by one. Their shouts and screams faded, replaced by growing unease. Malik's silence unnerved them more than any war cry could. It was as if the land itself had sent a spirit to fight on its behalf, a warrior whose power lay not in noise but in stillness. From atop a nearby hill, Afia watched the battle unfold. She raised her voice not to shout commands, but to narrate Malik's movements in a steady chant. Her words carried over the field, weaving a rhythm that lifted the spirits of their own villagers who watched from a distance. She spoke of strength, of courage, and of the silence that spoke louder than any sword. Her voice became a shield and a song, binding the village together in hope and defiance. The rival clans' resolve crumbled beneath Malik's relentless and silent assault. Their numbers thinned and soon panic set in. The invaders began to retreat, fleeing back toward the hills they came from. As they ran, whispers spread among them, tales of a spirit warrior with no voice, a silent guardian who fought not with cries but with a deadly calm that chilled the very air. When the dust settled and the sun climbed higher, the village of Kijiji Chamwisho stood victorious. Malik returned to Afia's side, still silent but stronger than ever. The battle had been won not with noise, but with the power of silence, and the story of the silent king spread, carried on the wind and in the hearts of all who witnessed it. Malik's footsteps were sure and steady as he led Afia higher into the mountains beyond Kijiji Chamwisho. The path was steep and narrow, winding through jagged rocks and ancient trees that whispered secrets older than time. Afia followed without question, her heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity and reverence. She had lived beside Malik for years, tending to his silent presence and witnessing his strange powers, but now she felt as if she were about to uncover the deepest truth behind the man who refused to speak. After hours of climbing, Malik stopped before a clearing. At its center stood a weathered stone altar, half buried in moss and lichen, worn smooth by centuries of rain and sun. The air here felt charged, heavy with an unseen energy that made Afia's skin tingle. The altar was etched with symbols that matched the ones Malik had carved into the trees, a language lost to most, but one tied closely to his family's ancient legacy. As Afia traced the worn carvings with her fingers, a story unfolded in her mind, a story of sacrifice, silence, and protection. Malik knelt beside the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered dust and drew shapes in the dirt. Then with deliberate care he wrote a message: "You gave me back my body. But I gave up my voice to keep you alive." The weight of those words settled over Afia like a heavy cloak. She realized that Malik's silence was not merely a curse or a wound, it was a deliberate act, a binding sacrifice made long ago in a battle none but the mountains remembered. His voice had been taken, stolen by an enemy's dark magic, not as punishment, but as a shield to protect the people he loved. In losing his voice, Malik had gained a sacred role, a guardian who spoke through his strength, his actions, and the very earth beneath their feet. Afia knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on the cold stone altar. As her fingers brushed its surface, a faint hum filled the air, a subtle vibration that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth itself. It was as if Malik's voice, though silenced in life, still lingered here, woven into the heart of the mountain. The sound was fragile but clear, like the whisper of a long-lost song carried on the wind. For a long moment, Afia closed her eyes and listened. She felt a connection stretch between the altar, Malik, and the land they both called home. It was a bond forged in sacrifice and silence, a promise etched in stone and blood. She understood now that Malik's silence was a gift, a language spoken not with words, but with heart and spirit. Together, they rose and began the descent back to the village, forever changed by what they had discovered. Malik's silence no longer felt like a burden, but a sacred vow. And Afia carried with her the voice of the mountains, a quiet strength that would guide them both in the days to come. Afia began to transform the barren patch of earth around their home into something extraordinary. With slow, deliberate care, she planted a garden, not just any garden, but one that held deep meaning for the village of Kijiji Chamwisho and for the silent warrior who lived with her. Each seed sown, each sprout nurtured, was a tribute to moments when Malik had quietly saved a life, moments often unseen by others but never forgotten by Afia. This garden grew into a sanctuary of stories without words, where every plant bore a name that echoed a chapter in Malik's silent bravery. Afia named a row of bright yellow mwangaza flowers after the day Malik guided a frightened child lost in the forest safely back to the village. The petals seemed to catch the light in a way that made them glow softly at dusk, a living beacon of hope and safety. Next to them, she planted Sadi Yamoyo, a fragrant herb whose gentle scent reminded her of the many times Malik's quiet presence soothed the restless heart in the dead of night. There was also the Ujasiri shrub, thorny and resilient, symbolizing the fierce courage Malik displayed without uttering a single sound. Over time, the garden became a tapestry of silent tales, a place where nature itself seemed to whisper the stories of a warrior who fought not with words, but with deeds. Malik joined Afia in tending to the garden, his hands rough and worn from years of silent labor but remarkably gentle when caring for the delicate plants. Afia would watch him prune the fragile buds or water the soil with quiet dedication, understanding more with each movement the deep love and respect he held for this place and for her. Though his lips never parted to speak, his actions sang a song of tenderness and strength, a silent language that needed no translation. Word of the garden spread beyond their home, and slowly villagers began to visit, not out of curiosity or for answers, but seeking the peace the garden radiated. They came carrying burdens, troubles, and doubts, but in the garden's calm embrace, those worries seemed to melt away. Mothers brought their children to walk among the flowers, elders found solace sitting beneath the shade of the Ujasiri shrubs, and the youth gathered to learn about strength beyond the battlefield. The garden became a refuge, a place to find quiet amidst the chaos of the village's long-standing conflicts. Afia took it upon herself to teach the children about the true power of listening and silence. She gathered them under the shade of a great baobab tree and told them stories not only of Malik's bravery but of the lessons she had learned from living beside a man who had sacrificed his voice for their people. "Speak while you can," she would say softly, her eyes shining with conviction, "but listen to those who cannot." The children listened intently, absorbing this wisdom as they watched Malik moving silently among the plants, his presence a living lesson in humility, respect, and quiet strength. As the seasons passed, Afia and Malik began hosting night vigils in the garden, gatherings unlike any the village had ever known. These were evenings of silence and deep listening, where villagers would gather around a fire, not to speak or debate, but to immerse themselves in the natural sounds that surrounded them, the crackling firewood, the rustling leaves, the distant call of nocturnal creatures. In this sacred space, the earth, the fire, and the wind spoke louder than any words. The villagers learned to appreciate the language of silence, to find comfort in stillness and presence. Malik, ever silent, was the centerpiece of these vigils. Though he never spoke, his calm, steady presence was a powerful reminder of the strength found in quiet endurance. To the villagers he was more than a warrior. He was a symbol of the power in listening and being fully present. Slowly, the fear that once clung to Malik's silence gave way to reverence and respect. At these vigils, the villagers shared no words but exchanged stories through the simple acts of being together in silence. They learned to honor each other's presence without interruption, to listen deeply not just to sounds, but to the unspoken emotions carried in the air. It was a radical form of connection, one that wove the community tighter through shared stillness and mindfulness. The garden flourished alongside this growing spirit of peace. It became a place where old wounds began to heal, where the echoes of the feud faded into the background as the land itself seemed to pulse with renewal. Each plant, each flower, was a testament to the power of transformation, of how even in the deepest silence, life could blossom fiercely. Children who once feared the story of the silent warrior now ran freely through the garden, learning to listen with their hearts. They were taught to value silence not as emptiness but as a space full of meaning and potential. Afia and Malik's home, surrounded by blooming plants and the quiet hum of nature, became a beacon of hope for Kijiji Chamwisho, a place where the past and present met in harmony. Over time, the villagers began to carry the lessons of the garden into their daily lives. Arguments quieted, respect grew between clans, and the harsh memories of the feud softened. They learned that sometimes the loudest victories were won in silence, that strength was not only in the spoken word or the clashing of swords, but in the patient endurance and listening that Malik embodied. Afia often found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first day she carved her name into the wooden floor beside Malik's bed. What had begun as a forced marriage to a dying man had blossomed into something far greater, a partnership rooted in quiet strength, healing, and an unspoken understanding deeper than any language. And so, the garden stood as a living monument to all they had endured and all they had become. It was a place where the earth, fire, and wind spoke softly to those willing to listen, a garden of quiet names, of silent stories, and of a love that thrived without a single spoken word. Years passed quietly in Kijiji Chamwisho. Seasons turned like the gentle pages of a well-read book, each chapter unfolding with the soft rhythm of nature's breath. Malik lived on, silent as ever, but his presence was no longer a mystery, no longer a cause for fear or suspicion. He had become a living legend, a guardian whose voice was not spoken but felt deep in the hearts of all who knew him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky with hues of amber and violet, Malik lay resting beside Afia in their home surrounded by the garden of quiet names. His breaths came slow and steady, each one a gentle whisper to the earth. Afia held his hand, rough and calloused from years of silent service, and felt the steady pulse of life beginning to wane. There were no tears of sorrow, only a profound sense of gratitude. Malik, the man who had given everything without a single word, was preparing to cross into the next world as silently as he had lived. In her heart, Afia knew this was not an end but a continuation, a passing of a sacred flame. When Malik finally exhaled his last breath, still silent, it was as if the very air held its breath in respect. Afia cradled him close, her tears tracing the map of years lived side by side. In that quiet moment, surrounded by the flowers named for his deeds and the earth he had protected, Malik slipped away with the dignity of a king who had never needed a crown or a voice to rule. His grave was simple, carved not with words but with symbols, a mouth open yet silent, eyes closed but watchful. This was Malik's epitaph, a powerful reminder that true strength lies beyond speech, in presence and sacrifice. The villagers gathered to honor him not with loud lamentations, but with silent gestures of respect. A flower laid at his feet, a bowed head, a shared moment of stillness. Afia stood by his grave for a long time, feeling the weight of her journey, the girl who had been forced into a marriage she did not want, the woman who had found purpose beside a man who had lost his voice. She vowed to carry forward his legacy, to teach generations the lessons whispered through years of silence and strength. In the days and years that followed, Afia became a revered teacher and storyteller. She spoke not only of Malik's bravery but of the profound power found in listening, in presence, and in the courage to endure without complaint. Her teaching spread far beyond the village, carried by travelers, traders, and wandering spirits who found meaning in her words. She was forced to marry a dying man, the story was told, but what rose beside her was not death. It was purpose. This refrain became a mantra for those facing hardship, a reminder that even the darkest beginnings could birth something radiant. The garden of quiet names flourished under Afia's care, becoming a sacred space where villagers and visitors alike came to reflect on the power of silence and the strength of the human spirit. People traveled from distant lands to witness the place where a silent king had lived and loved without ever uttering a sound. When storms struck Kijiji Chamwisho, the villagers no longer feared the fierce winds and roaring thunder. Instead, they listened closely as the wind hummed softly through the trees, like a voice carried down from the mountains, a song of protection and remembrance. It was as if Malik's spirit had become one with the land itself, his silence transformed into a song that echoed forever in the natural world. Afia, now aged and wise, often stood at the edge of the garden, feeling the wind brush past her face. She smiled, knowing that Malik's voice was never truly lost. It lived on in every whisper of the earth, in every rustle of leaves, and in the hearts of all who learned to listen with more than just their ears. And so, the story of Malik and Afia became legend, a tale not of words but of silence, not of endings but of enduring purpose. The silent king had ruled without a voice, and through him the village had learned that sometimes, the loudest song is the one sung in quiet strength.